Reading the Old Testament, an introduction by Lawrence Boadt. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing that last name. Somebody let me know in the comments. My best guess is Boadt. Anyways, why I read this book. So if you've been following this channel, you'll know that I've been on a project to reread the Bible. I read the Bible once long ago as a young adolescent when I was growing up in the Christian church. I no longer consider myself a Christian. I'm an agnostic now, but I'm rereading the Bible as part of my project to read the great works of the Western canon, which is partially inspired by Steve Donahue and his Western Canon Starter Kit videos. Now, in those videos, Steve Donahue mentions that it's good to read the Bible, but it's also, considering what an influential book this is, it's good to read it and reread it, and also read commentaries on it to get as much out of it as you can. And certainly my experience rereading it is that I am desperate for commentaries. I mean, there is just all this stuff that doesn't appear to make a lot of sense, or that you really want more historical details on. And if you've been watching my videos I've been making as I've been reading through the Bible, you'll know that there have been any number of odds and ends that have puzzled me as I've been reading through this. So I've been looking for a good commentary. Now, I have been making good use of Wikipedia and the internet and everything like that, and there is a lot of helpful and interesting information on the internet, but it's also nice to just have a book. Now, I say this in every video, but because I live in Vietnam, my access to English books is limited. But there are some used booksellers on Book Street, and one of them does actually have a decent religion section. A couple shelves at least. So whenever I'm in there, I check to see if there are any informative books on the Bible. Usually there are a lot of devotional books in that section, but not like a lot of textbooks on the Bible. But then one week I was checking and I found this book, and this was exactly what I was looking for. So very lucky to find this. This is, I just stumbled upon it at random at a used bookstore. So I was really happy with this book, and having read it, I think this is a very lucky find. But that being said, if somebody knows of any other books, by all means, let me know in the comments down below. This is, as it turns out, a Catholic book published by Paulist Press, which is a Catholic, what's the word I'm looking for? Catholic publisher. Ugh. Starting to forget basic words. I've been in Vietnam too long. Anyways, published by a Catholic publishing house, and the author is a Catholic scholar. So it's from a religious point of view, and also different than my own upbringing, which is Protestant. But different can be good. So, one of the interesting things about this version, which is different than the Protestant books I grew up on, is it includes the Deuterocanon, the books that are in the Catholic Bible and are not in the Protestant Bible. So that was interesting to read through. So you can see here, the books that are underlined are found only in Catholic Bibles. And as it would happen, the version of the Bible I'm using for my reread of the Bible is also a Catholic version. And I haven't actually worked my way up to the Deuterocanon books yet, but I will, and they are in this version. So if you're reading a Catholic version of the Bible, it's nice to have a Catholic introduction with it. Now, I actually have read some books on biblical scholarship before. I got curious about 10 years ago and read some books, some of which I've reviewed on this channel. the Bart Ehrman, a couple Bart Ehrman books. Of course, Bart Ehrman writes about the New Testament, not the Old Testament. But relevant to the Old Testament is The Unauthorized Version by Robin Lane Fox, which has an unfortunate title. The title makes it sound like it's by a conspiracy nut, but Robin Lane Fox is actually a very well-respected classicist. And also listen to the Yale University Open Lecture Series on the Old Testament by Christine Hayes. And I've talked about both of those on this channel before. So I'll link to my reviews of them in the description down below, and I'll be using some of the knowledge I got from their YouTube series and book to evaluate this book or to compare it with this book. I've got a tendency to sometimes get carried away when I'm talking about the Old Testament. It's a source of endless fascination to me, partly because I grew up with it, and partly because I'm interested in ancient history, and there's a lot of ancient history in the Old Testament, and we'll get into that in just a moment, right? The Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Egyptians, the Persians, the Greeks, if you're reading the Catholic Bible. So, yeah, there's a lot of really fascinating stuff in there. In fact, when I was making videos on the unauthorized version by Robin Lane Fox, got a little carried away and made 5 videos totaling about 2 hours and a half total. Which, looking back on that was a little bit of an excess, perhaps a little bit of an overindulgence. So, I'm not going to do that this time. My camera has a 30-minute time limit. I'll probably talk up until the time limit on the camera, but I'm not going to make multiple videos this time. I'm just going to try and talk about this in generalities without going off onto tangents of every single thing that interested me. At least that's the goal. I always do these videos unscripted, so we'll see how we do. But that's the goal here. But yeah, there is a lot of fascinating stuff in here. Now, this book, despite being written by a Catholic scholar, is actually something that I think very few atheists would have issue with. He's using all the latest scholarship on the historical findings about the Old Testament, and he is not approaching this from a fundamentalist point of view at all. So he will say which parts of the Bible are historical and which parts of the Bible are not historical. For example, one example of many, but when he is talking about the flood story in the book of Genesis, he does not shy away from pointing out that it seems to be the same story that occurs in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and compares those two together here. This is a story that the Hebrews have borrowed either directly from the Epic of Gilgamesh or indirectly from other stories in the area that shared the same origin. And yeah, that's just one example, but it's just all the way through. There's an interesting theological question to get into about if you know that so much of the Bible is not historical, if you know that the conquest of Canaan was not historical, or that the book of Esther never happened, or that the stories in Daniel didn't really happen, which is all in here, then what's to keep your faith in the Bible? And that's an interesting question, but it's a question for another day and another video, because Lawrence Boadt doesn't concern himself with that at all. He is simply concerned with just giving you the information about the Old Testament in here. The first couple chapters and the last 2 chapters do attempt to kind of set this up with with some sort of faith-based framework. But it's not the question of how do we still believe, knowing that the Bible is a lot of the historical parts of the Bible are not true. It's more of a question of like, why is studying the Old Testament important to Christians? It's much more general than that. So the question of biblical inerrancy and how much does it matter to Christians that a lot of the history parts of the Bible are not real history. He's not interested in that question at all, and hence I don't think it's appropriate to talk about it in this book review. It's a question for another day when we're concerned with an author who's concerned about that. What he is, once you get past the first couple chapters, what he is concerned about doing is just presenting the Old Testament as history and literature. So what are the literary themes? What is the historic themes? So here, this part on David here is a perfect example. So he's setting up the history of David, and he believes David is historical. There's some question on this, but you can at least make the case that David might be historical. So he says, the picture of David, however, is not all rosy. Because of his successes, legends of his greatness grew up around him, just as the Iliad and the Odyssey report the great legends from Achilles and Odysseus in ancient Greek, and the French national epic of Roland and the Spanish national epic of the Cid tells of Charlemagne's leadership in the Dark Ages. Despite the high praises of the Bible, David may well have been a scheming and calculating warlord who rose to power by less than fully honest means. And then he goes on to examine what the evidence for that may be in the Bible. So notice he's talking about contrasting the biblical story with maybe what the real history may have been here. And also talking about how the biblical authors wanted to set this up as a national epic and compares it to other national epics from different countries. So the history and the literature. And as such, if you are interested in the Old Testament for the history and the literature, I would recommend this book to anybody. Be you a Christian or be you a non-Christian. The actual meat of this book, when he is talking about the literary themes in the Bible and the history of this Bible, can be appreciated by anybody. And there's just so much interesting stuff in here. Now, I said I'm not going to talk about everything, but I just want to show a few things. So he talks about the JEPD theory. Talks a lot about this. This is something I've talked about before on this channel, and again, it's something I've learned from other sources. When the aforementioned unauthorized version by Robin Lane Fox and the Christian Hayes Yale lectures, it's the theory that the Pentateuch was not actually written by Moses, but was composed of 4 different sources. The Yahweh source, known as J because it's Germans who came up with this theory. The Elohist source, E. The priestly source, P. The Deuteronomist source, D. And he breaks down what the different themes of the sources are and what the sources for the sources are. So these are the sources for J. These are the sources for E. So we start off with J, which is the bulk of the narrative. J gets combined with E. Later around, D comes, and then P is the final editor. Which actually, I believe I've misspoken this channel in the past when I said D was the final editor. I think I was getting the D source mixed up with the Deuteronomistic historian, which, yeah. In fact, reading this book, it's interesting. There's any number of things that it looks like I may have gotten wrong in some of my talking about the Bible, which is a reminder to always take me with a grain of salt. I get things wrong sometimes. So one example here, and this isn't so much me getting something wrong, but this is just an alternative viewpoint on something. When I was talking about Ruth in my video on the book of Ruth, I said what I believed I picked up from Christian Hayes' lectures on the book of Ruth, that the book of Ruth was a response to the racial purity going on in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah forbid intermarriage with the other races, especially the Moabites. The book of Ruth is a story all about how a Moabite woman becomes accepted into the community of Israel. But Lawrence Boadt has a slightly different interpretation of Ruth, although he does acknowledge that it is contrasting with the racial purity in Ezra and Nehemiah here. But he places the book of Ruth with the book of Esther and the book of Tobit from the Catholic Bible, as one of the historical fictions that was popular in the Hellenistic period. So I guess when the Greek world took over Palestine, there were these there were these novels similar to like the Greek novels of the time, and Esther and Ruth and Tobit may all come from that period. So I don't know who's right and who's wrong. I'm no scholar myself, but it's just a reminder to me. This is a note to myself to just be careful of being too reliant on one author, because there are a whole bunch of different theories about stuff. So having made this disclaimer that you should always take me with a grain of salt, I guess take me with a grain of salt when I review this book, because I'm not a scholar myself. But it certainly seems to line up with the other stuff I've read on biblical scholarship in the Old Testament. And then there's a whole lot in here I didn't know about. But I'm inclined to believe that wherever there's something I didn't know about previously, that this author is right. I mean, he just the stuff I know about he lines up with, and the stuff I don't know about he certainly sounds like he knows what he's talking about. With a couple exceptions. So there were one or two cases where he said something and then I looked it up and it didn't quite match what he was saying. And I'm inclined to believe that these are just exceptions to the rule, but I want to highlight them just to be clear. So he's mentioned 2 Kings 6:26-30, when King Jehoshaphat of Judah acts as a judge in the case of a woman who ate her own child. So I read 2 Kings recently in my read-through of the Bible and reviewed it on this channel, and I did not remember that at all. So I went and I looked up that passage, and I'm pretty sure that's not King Jehoshaphat. It's referring to the king of Israel in this story. It doesn't say which king of Israel. As I said in my review of 2 Kings, some of the Elijah stories just refer to a generic king of Israel instead of naming which king it was. I'm not sure if that's part of because of the source, but anyways, it's not King Jehoshaphat of Judah, unless somebody let me know if I'm grossly misinterpreting this, but I'm fairly sure it's not King Jehoshaphat of Judah. So chalk that up as kind of one thing. Another thing, we're getting into a little bit of nitpicks here, but when talking about the difference between Chronicles and Kings in the historical narrative, he talks about how in 2 Chronicles, David does not build the temple, but he plans the temple. So, David never built the temple himself. In Chronicles, he gets everything ready and makes all the plans, which Solomon only has to carry out. Despite the fact that this clearly contradicts the views of the authors of Samuel and Kings, that David was forbidden to plan a temple. So even to plan a temple, David was forbidden. See 2 Samuel 7. So I didn't actually remember this. And again, I've just read through or reread through 2 Samuel recently. So I went and looked it up, and I can't find, did I miss something? I can't find any reference in 2 Samuel 7 to David being forbidden to plan the temple. Maybe I missed it, but I'm inclined to say that this might be another inaccuracy, maybe. Okay, and then one more I'm going to share with you over here. He's discussing the Deuterocanon, what Protestants call the Apocrypha, which is 7 books that are in the Catholic Bibles, but not in the Protestant Bibles. And he says, all 7 of the Deuterocanonical books, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Judith, Tobit, Baruch, Sirach, and the Wisdom of Solomon, are known and referred to by authors in the New Testament. Now, this contradicts what I had learned as a young lad, which is that Protestants rejected the Deuterocanonical books precisely because they were not known and referred to in the New Testament. More than that, I could not think of any references to the Deuterocanon in the New Testament. And I grew up in the church, so I like to think I know the New Testament well. I mean, there's no point in the New Testament where Paul says, as Tobit said, or as in the book of Judith, right? These books are never quoted in the New Testament, right? But here it says all 7 of the books are known and referred to by the authors in the New Testament. So I Googled this, and it looks like none of the New Testament writers ever quoted the Deuterocanon directly. There are any number of passages which may have been influenced by the Deuterocanon depending on how you interpret them. And you can Google this yourself and check out some of the websites which talk about some New Testament passages which have kind of similar parallels in some of the Deuterocanon books, but may or may not be references and certainly are not direct quotations. So this is another thing I'm going to count as maybe slightly misleading, or maybe you can count this as a Catholic bias. I don't know. So all of which is to say, I guess, I don't know. What gives me a little bit of pause is there are any number of times when I did not look up the verse. When I just kind of took his word for it, or when I did not double check, when I did not stop reading to Google it and double check what he was saying. So it makes me wonder if there's any other mistakes I missed in here. Probably there are, huh? Those are just 3 that I caught because they jumped out at me. But there's probably any. Those are the 3 I caught. How many other inaccuracies are there in here? There's also a few typos, mixes up Gibeon and Gideon, the B and the D. I don't know if that's because this is kind of a smaller religious press, not like a major publishing house. Maybe these typos are more likely to go through. So all of that is by way of disclaimer. But that disclaimer out of the way, by and large, like I said, this book lined up with what I knew about biblical scholarship, and seemed to be an author who really knows his stuff. And I found it just fascinating. If you are interested in the Old Testament as history or literature, so not like devotional, although they're not mutually exclusive, obviously. But if you're interested in learning about the history or literature of the New Testament, this is fascinating. I mean, look at all the fascinating stuff in here. So here's Sennacherib's attack on Jerusalem. This is the siege of Jerusalem by Sennacherib of the Assyrian army when Hezekiah was king of Judah. And we have the source from 2 Kings, which tells the story in the Bible. But we also have the Assyrian version of this, because the Assyrians also reported the same siege. So he lines up the 2 accounts side by side. He points out the differences. The only difference is the amount of tribute, and then maybe an exaggeration maybe due to either Assyrian exaggeration or differences in weighting the talents. Just fascinating if you're interested in history. He goes through the historical backgrounds to the what was happening in northern and Israel and southern Judah during the age of the kings. He talks about how there was a period where the Assyrian Empire was getting bogged down, which allowed the northern kingdom to have an age of prosperity. Now, I mean, I had, again, just gotten done reading 2 Kings, read it relatively recently, which talked about this kind of stuff. Sorry, let me just start again. 2 Kings talked about these kings and their deeds, but nowhere from the Bible do you get the background information that this was in a period when the Assyrian Empire was in a little bit of retreat and reorganization. And so that allowed Israel to come into its own. But then after the Assyrian Empire got its act together and became resurgent again, then it invaded and broke up the northern kingdom into 4 provinces. Now, unless I'm forgetting something, these 4 provinces are not actually in the Bible, right? So where is this coming from? I guess this must be coming from Assyrian sources, or I don't know. There were a few cases when he was talking about the background history to the period of Kings Israel and Judah, where he was throwing in all these fascinating historical details which were not in the Bible. And sometimes he says where he got them from, and sometimes he didn't. I sometimes wish he would have some of these details say how we actually know this. But and again, I said I wasn't going to go into anything, and I don't have time to go into everything, but just so many fascinating details about the Babylonian Empire, Persian Empire, and their interaction with Israel and the Kingdom of Judah. And now his speciality actually is the prophets. This is what he was mainly interested in. So he's written especially in the prophets. So partly because this is a speciality, or partly because the prophets just make up a lot of the Old Testament, he talks a lot about the prophets. And again, he's doing this from though he's Catholic himself, he's using the scholarship to talk about this. So he's talking about what looks like it was actually written by that prophet and what looks to be later additions and stuff like that. I always used to find the prophets a little bit boring when I was younger. You know, I like the history stuff, but when we get into these long books of prophecies, that's when I find it a little bit boring. But by putting these prophets in the historical context, like when he's talking about the prophet Amos, showing that this is actually, a real, authentic, surviving voice from this time period, talking about this point in history, or all the prophets really. He makes it a lot more interesting. Now, when he's going too much into the themes of the prophets or their literary techniques, that's where I start to lose interest a little bit. That's maybe just me personally. I'm more interested in narrative history than literature. But if you're interested in the literature aspect of it, the poetry or the symbolism that the prophets employ, he does a very good job of bringing that forth, in addition to giving the historical background to the prophets. So yeah, a lot of really interesting stuff in here. It's a little bit unclear when exactly this was published. At one point, he's making reference to the 19th century. And then he says, he says, at the beginning of the 19th century, blah, 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 blah. And then 150 years later, and I think 150 years later, the 19th century was like 225 years ago. But it looks like this book was originally published in 1969. But then I think it was, looks like it was updated in 1984. Now the author has since passed away, it looks like, according to his Wikipedia page. But I don't know how much of this book would be different if it was written like this year in terms of the modern scholarship. But again, in terms of what I know from other sources, this seemed to line up pretty well. So I don't know how much advances in biblical scholarship there have been since 1984. I'm out of time. I'm going to have to finish here. There's a lot of fascinating stuff in here. I can't talk about it all.